for all the terrible things about the pandemic, in a way that was maybe the technology was the bright spot in all of that period, because it does feel like we recovered the ability to use the technology as what Bill Buxton called a social prosthetic, this way of connecting with
Hmm.
each other.
Hmm.
And in some ways, it made our interviews much more personal and connected, because suddenly you weren't like, I wasn't asking a guest to go into a studio that the BBC had or that the NPR had or whatever.
Right.
You're in their living room basically, and you're
Right. Right.
all trying to figure out the technology together and why, oh, you're on mute and all that kind of stuff. It was very humanizing in a certain.
To say I've been looking forward to this episode would be an understatement. And I know it sounds a little superfluous, and probably I say something maybe similar every time, and it's not disingenuous. However, Nora Young is somebody that I have admired for a long time. Nora was the host of CBC Spark, which is an iconic program here in Canada around technology, the intersection of society and philosophy and technology. And throughout her tenure as host, had so many amazing guests and stories that really challenged my thinking. And so I don't even know why I thought I could even ask her, but I thought, oh, what's it hurt? I can just ask her. She can say no, but she didn't. She's just was a gracious and lovely person. We connected way back in the fall, and with her schedule and so forth, it did take us a while to find a time to connect, but we did, and we had just a fantastic conversation, as you'll soon hear. And if you're not familiar, unfortunately, Spark tenure came to an end, and Nora is now working on some other equally interesting projects. But the archive even of Spark is worth your while. So just even doing a little searching through there and looking at some topics. We talked a lot about sort of the staying power of technology being something that is so changing so quickly, and how much of things we discussed and explored 10 years ago are still relevant. And there are certainly things that still are, and I know Nora seeks to continue to find the humanity in all this, which is another fascinating element of this one. But I feel very privileged that she agreed and took the time to have this conversation. So I am delighted to present to you this episode with Nora Young.
All right, Nora, as I already said to you in our sort of pre-chat, I'm very excited to have you on the show. And I know others will just be amazed with you. And I feel like right off the bat, if people don't know who you are and don't have looked through the library of resources that you've created and have on Spark, I think there's so many really rich, fascinating ones. There's ones that I've bookmarked over the time. So that's the wonderful part of that. Now, as a journalist, how did you fall into, and I'm going to say podcasting or radio, because I think when you first started, you probably would have used the term radio. And so I don't know when it morphed into podcasting and radio, but like, where did that all begin?
Yeah, Spark was one of the very first shows on CBC that had a podcast, but I wasn't right from the beginning. I think we were radio only for at least maybe first half a year or so. But yeah, it's funny that you use the term fell into it, because I did fall into it really. Like, I knew from pretty young age that I wanted to be a journalist, but my default was print because that was what I was
Sure.
familiar with. And then I was looking for work and freelancing, and I found this little ad at the back of Now magazine, which was an alternative weekly in Toronto, like the Georgia Straight or the Coast, that kind of thing. And they were taking auditions for this new radio show. So I started doing those auditions and became a stringer on that show. And after a year, that show became DNTO, which was the first show I hosted at CBC. And then I pretty quickly came to fall in love with audio, because it's very creative. It's very intimate. It's cheap, which means you can be more creative because you don't have this huge overhead. So I really fell in love with it as a medium, but I did actually fall off into it by accident in a way. And then sometimes I think, what if I never read Now magazine that day, right?
Yeah.
What would I be doing all this time later?
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of people that have that. I think of my own sort of journey into technology. It wasn't something that, I always wanted to do that. It just happened. And so that's always an interesting story. But even then, so again, you're a journalist, and was technology always the focus, or is that something you also, I don't know, fell into, or like, how did that focus and interest evolve?
Yeah, if I think back on it, I think my mom probably had a pretty big influence on me in that respect, because she was a person who was always very curious about the new thing, the next thing. She was really curious about understanding how things worked, understanding design and why things were built the way they were built. And so I'm sure I got a fair bit of that from her. She also would buy technology. Like, she bought us like a little cassette recorder with a microphone. And you remember the old Super 8 video cameras or whatever, film cameras, I guess they were. And she encouraged us not just to make sort of classical movies, but to experiment and to play with the technology,
Right.
right? But it really, actually, there's a role for educators in my story in this respect, because it was really when I was doing my undergrad in political science. I was taking a course in Canadian political economy taught by the late Mel Watkins and David Rayside, and they started doing this whole thing about this, at the time, new idea of the impacts of digital technology. They were looking at the impacts of digital technology on the factory floor and computer assisted design and things like that. And that was like a classic light bulb moment for me, where I really thought, this is interesting, right? There's something here about the connection between technology as a lens to look at society and economy and politics that was very compelling for me. And that really turned a page, and that affected pretty much everything I did after that.
Yeah, that's obviously what makes Spark and that kind of that legacy that you have in that space really so powerful, is making those connections. That was always what drew me to it. It was like, okay, so here's this technology, but it has these sometimes intended, sometimes really unintended consequences, and how do we wrap our heads around that one? So when you think about, all right, you're gonna put together the highlight reel of Spark. So you're gonna take all your episodes, put it together. It's like, all right, you got to come up with the highlight reel, and you're gonna curate that. What are some of the kind of highlights that come to you in terms of, maybe it was a guest that was like just phenomenal, or maybe not so phenomenal, or an idea that really pushed your thinking, like, jeeper, I'd never thought of that before, and this is really changing me in some way. So what's the highlight reel for Spark?
Yeah, there's so many guests like that really changed the way I thought about things. And especially in the early years of the show, launched in 2007, and we were really trying to think through essentially what would the internet sound like if it was a radio show, right? What does it mean to make an audio product when you're not really going one to many, but you're really going many to many? And how do we
Right.
reflect in what we do? And so a lot of the guests we had through the whole course of the show, but we're reflecting on the idea of what does digital culture mean, and what does that mean for all of our institutions, the way we live our lives. So that was very exciting. And I think education to me was a really good example of that, because I'm not an educator, obviously, but it seems to me that in the education sphere, there's a lot of thinking about the meta level, right? The pedagogy. How do we do what we do, and how does the technology change the way we do that? And so there were a lot of really interesting conversations around the early days of all the excitement around MOOCs, for example.
Right.
But more broadly, just what does it mean to teach and to engage students when you don't have the same constraints of time and space, and when you have the proverbial fire hose of information at your disposal? And what does that mean for what is the inherent value of being together in person? How does it change what it means to communicate information? All of that stuff was really interesting, but also an object lesson in how challenging technological change is, right? Because it affects all of these things about the institution, how you engage in your teaching practice, how you communicate with your students, how the institution, how the Board of Education works, all that other kind of stuff. So education, when we talked to Kathy Davidson, who I think is at City
Duke.
University of New York now. Oh, and maybe she's at Duke, yeah. And okay. And Bonnie Stewart, who's at University of Windsor
Yeah.
now. And people who are really engaged in the early days of thinking about how to reshape uh, education. And I think part of the reason I think so fondly of those is because when you're involved in any kind of long-term project, you remember the beginning parts so clearly, right? Like by the time we got to 2013, 2014, it's a bit more of a blur, but like in 2007, 2008, 2009, those memories are very clear. And the other thing that I really loved, which was a huge um, privilege of working on the show, was just the ability to talk to philosophers and have a good long chew over ideas that in some cases were like, in some cases we would come up with a question. Like I had one question I remember of like, why is it that when we see a scary movie and it's new, we're scared by this effects that we see, but when we watch King Kong or a really old movie, we no longer find that scary. So he went on this hunt to find philosophers of perception and talked to them about this crazy question.
Yeah.
But what a huge gift to make a show that lets you do that kind of stuff and explore your natural curiosity. And this is a thing that, maybe you have this experience too with the podcast because it's really a gift to have people come on who just want to talk to you about what they're interested in.
Yeah.
And as a journalist, you don't actually get that experience very often. Like people often have, understandably, like an agenda or an album that they're promoting or whatever it is, right? We would just talk to people who just wanted to tell us what they thought, which is a huge privilege.
Do you think when you look back to that time, and nostalgic is a funny thing, right? The way it works in your brain, but it seems to me, and I'm speaking from my experience, that time was filled with a little bit more optimism around what technology could do. Now, as somebody who was advocating for technology in schools, yes, there were detractors who people thought, does this really have a place and so forth. But I had no kind of hesitation to say, I get it, but there's so many more opportunities here than there are distractions. I obviously we'll talk more about AI and things. I don't feel that way today about technology, but I did then. And I don't know if that was naivety on my part or whether that was actually, I was understanding things the way that they were. So I don't know what, when you think back to that, like just your feeling about technology. And again, you're a journalist, so you're trying not to have too much of a bias, but yeah, you do more than most.
It was a very exciting time. I would say up until around like maybe 2013 or so, or maybe even till that watershed Cambridge Analytica moment, it just, you could see all the potential. And I was like, in retrospect, it feels naive, right? That we didn't anticipate all of the downsides that have come along with that. But it's also true that at that time, it wasn't obvious that we were going to see this whole venture capital hockey stick growth. And we didn't anticipate the global scale of some of these technology giants, right? So if you think about the technologies that were in place at the time, those early digital technologies that were so powerful, a lot of them were just built, they were open source, they were built for free, not built for free, but they were built by people who weren't necessarily expecting to become the next unicorn or whatever. So the conditions were ripe to feel that optimism.
Right.
And it doesn't mean that people aren't still building incredible things or that there's anything inherently wrong with wanting to have hockey stick growth, but it's shaped the parameters of the conversation about technology in a way that I certainly didn't anticipate in certain years.
And yeah, and obviously you look at 2007, I think that's right around the birth of Twitter. And as somebody who was an early adopter, this was like amazing. I was connecting with all these people from all over who were interested in weird things around education or sports or whatever my interests were. And I really, again, personally I like the blurring of the professional and personal. Like that was like how we connect as humans, but also how we can support each other as colleagues in a profession. And then things like Arab Spring and so forth that were really, I look back at like Clay Shirky, who was like this strong advocate for, you look at the books he wrote and read them, and it's like, this has so much potential. And then I distinctly remember, and again, I haven't followed him of late, but he wrote an article in the New York Times about how he doesn't want his kids to have laptops in the classroom anymore, which was quite a shift away from let's all go, this is going to be the best thing ever. Do you have a sort of a point on that timeline where you remember thinking, like, like maybe things are turning the other way? Was it just a sort of a slow burn towards that way? Or were there things, I'm thinking about shows that you had where people were saying, yes, there's a majority of this is awesome. Not that nobody didn't recognize, but was there somebody or something that came along that said, oh yeah, that I should have, that was an early sign that maybe this isn't going to go well?
Yeah. Trying to think of whether it was like whether there were those sort of watershed moments. We've certainly talked to people like Nicholas Parr, remember, wrote "Is Google
Sure.
Making You Stupid?" Um, I think maybe it was really around the Cambridge Analytical moment where you, to use that overused word, where you realize that this technology could be weaponized, not just that there would be unintended consequences, which there always are of new technologies, or downsides, which there always are of new technology, but that it could really be the very power of the technology could be used for against it. But it's in some ways, for all the terrible things about the pandemic, in a way that was maybe the technology was the bright spot in all of that period, because it does feel like we recovered the ability to use the technology as what Bill Buxton called a social prosthetic, this way of connecting with each other. And in some ways, it made our interviews much more personal and connected, because suddenly you weren't like, I wasn't asking a guest to go into a studio that the BBC had or that the NPR had or whatever.
Right.
You're in their living room basically, and you're
Right.
all trying to figure out the technology together and why, oh, you're on mute and all that kind of stuff. It was very humanizing in a certain. So that, as I say, for all the terrible things about the pandemic, that was a little source of optimism for me. And also, again, thinking, okay, this is great, but then I still repeat person with people
Yeah.
as well, right? Recognizing the power of that in-person moment as well.
And you're making me think about a couple things when you talked about we're all figuring this out together. And again, I want to talk more specifically about AI, but the AI work I'm doing now, what I'm finding invigorating about it is that we are all learning it together. Nobody's got it all figured out. And so there's this idea of, even when I come in, I'm saying I am not an expert. What I am is I'm the high school teacher that's read 3 chapters ahead of you. That's all I have. I just know a little bit more, but I really don't understand this. And so we're going to do this together. So there's that moment in time. And when I look back to whatever, 2007, those early days, there was more of I felt like a gap between those who understood, had access. There was an equity issue that I felt exists. And I always felt I was always wary of talking down to people who didn't understand some of the technology, who weren't using it in any way. So that idea of, oh, we're all figuring this together. And even, I said part of it, it reminds me a tiny bit, it's not a great example of like when people come together with a tragedy, like even thinking about, we just talked about the Four Nations Cup and how it's brought our country together because of this political strife. So there's a little bit of, I don't want to say common enemy, that's not exactly what I mean, but like that, let's come together, let's rally. So I love that idea of thinking about how do technologies help us rally around something as we try to figure out what this actually means for us, which is, again, the whole basis of what Spark was. We're trying to figure that out together. That notion of community really underlies that for me anyways, as I think about how we're moving today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that you're right, that it is most apparent in AI. Whenever you talk to people about AI and you talk to organizations and you get beyond the sort of initial thing, and then you realize, oh, everyone really is just we're experimenting, we're piloting, we're trying to figure it out. But that's a healthy space to be in. It's like, how do we, and hopefully we've learned some lesson in the adoption of new technological tools about how do you do it in a way that takes advantage of the potential and minimizes the downsides.
So I want to ask you a little bit about, because I always think this is, I don't know if when you wrote your book, The Virtual Self, 13 years ago, whether as you're writing, you're thinking, I wonder how long this is going to stay relevant. And if you're writing it with a sense of, hey, I'd love for people 20 years from now to pick this book up and say, hey, this means something to you. So I just love you to look back to see what you wrote then has been confirmed and continued to be true, and or as if there's anything it's said or thought that then, but I see how that's changed over the years, because of course we move in a world where things change really quickly in this space.
Yeah. The specifics certainly changed. And I was aware that I didn't want to talk too much about very specific technologies because it would give it such a short shelf life. But the book, just in very broad terms, was about our individual preference for self-tracking, for telling the story of ourselves in this quantified self kind of way, and how that related on the global scale, the societal scale, to this explosion of data out that or thing about how we're interacting with the world. So the first part, I feel like still, although the technology has changed, that feels still true to me, that we live our lives by, many of us live our lives by numbers in a way that we didn't before. You look at the popularity of Apple Watches and things like that. But then I also did not really anticipate the whole, like I mostly thought at a societal level about things like the Internet of Things. I really did not anticipate the whole explosion of machine learning that was specifically based on access to all this training data and this strange kind of feedback loop that we find ourselves in now between the data we put out there and the machines around us being trained on that data and then that interacting with us and so forth. So that I really missed the boat on. But yeah, I stand behind some of what I saw there about the explosion of data, but as is often the case whenever you try to do any type of futurology, I missed a giant elephant in the room.
Again, there are a few. I love the fact that people are still talking about Marshall McLuhan and Neil Postman, who wrote about this stuff. Didn't have, I don't know, they were ever asked directly about like they could have imagined today, but it sure seems like they had a sense of this is how this is going to go, people, and technologies, whether it's a pencil or anything else, have a certain impact on us as humans, and that becomes very fascinating. And so I want to just step back a little bit and focus a little bit more on education. And again, I love perspectives of quote unquote non-educators, but sometimes we say, hey, we're all teachers, and we are, right? And we're all learners at the same time. But when you think about, even if you take your own personal experience as a child, as a student in a K-12 and then in post-secondary, and you think about the way you experienced education and learning, now you have a deeper understanding of the role of technology in learning, even as a professional and as just as a human. What kind of lessons do you draw from that? And again, I don't want to put you in a position where you're giving advice to educators. That's not what I'm saying. But what are your perceptions about what you think the learning experience can and should be for kids today?
Oh, wow.
I get it. Big question. Sorry.
I have to say, Steve, you're doing a classic Nora Young question there, which is to ask make a very long thought and then say, and what do you think?
I'm sorry.
So I get that. I do that all the time. Yeah, I think what I see in my own life is I used to be a big reader of books and would happily sit down with a book and read without distractions for hours. And I can't do that anymore. I really can't. I can't. I have to be like on vacation or something and get very unplugged in order to do that, because my experience of reading and getting information has become very click on this, get this. And even when I'm reading a paper book,
I don't think that's just a you problem. You
no, I
obviously
don't think it is
realize
even.
that.
Yeah, I know, and I think that change is very real. And now we have, is it like the second generation of kids coming into school who have never had an experience of otherwise, have never had an
Right.
experience that is not, and maybe that's good. Like maybe it's just leading us to a different relational way of thinking and modular way of thinking and making connections amongst things, as opposed to following things in a very linear way. But it certainly is a radical change. And I lament the loss of that ability to just really absorb a linear argument. And in part, it happens as a journalist, because even when I'm reading a paper book, preparing for an interview, I'm always reading it in this sort of hunting for quote, looking for questions, finding a contrast issue in the argument or whatever, rather than just reading and absorbing and thinking about it. That doesn't really answer your.
Well, so what you're teasing out for me is some of the challenges that educators have faced, particularly in the last 15 years with the advent of technology. That is, parents who had an experience in school that was maybe successful, maybe they liked it and want that same experience for their kid. Why can't they just do this? Why can't they just whatever, whether it's learn your times table or memorize historical facts? And it's not just technology, it's an understanding of pedagogy and how people actually do learn and what should they learn. Because that's, again, when you have a device in your hand that has the world's information on it, the question, like, do I need to know the founding, when Canada was founded? What do I just look that up? So there's always that.
Mhm.
So there's that angst that you're saying. I remember learning in this way that I liked, and yes, you're trying to think about, like, how do we bring that back? How do we allow ourselves to slow down, to absorb, and not just succumb to the pace of the world around us? So there's a little bit of a battle against that. And then there's also a little bit, but this is the way the world is, and we need to help people adjust. And so that's, and again, I think the work that you do is pretty mirrored in that, because we're trying to figure that out as a society, let alone in education, right? So how do we hold
Yeah.
on to what makes us human, and all the things that when technology is there we love, but also take advantage of what technology can do in its most positive ways. I don't know. I
Yeah.
didn't
And
set up the question for you really well.
no, but I think I go waver in this regard because on the one hand, I think, and maybe this resonates for educators, that our relationship to technologies, whether they're paper books or the internet or whatever it is, has always been changing, right? Like it
Mhm.
makes a difference if you're using a slate or a
Sure.
pen and paper or whatever. Like that's in the nature of being human. That the way we absorb information, the way we process information is always changing, fundamental to our condition. But then there's the other part of me that thinks when people talk about this question of do you need to know facts, people point back to what was it Aristotle who said people aren't going to be able to remember anything once we
Right.
have
If we start writing
writing.
stuff down,
Right.
society's
And
lost here.
and people say it's how naive. Except that he was right in the sense that you don't who do you know around you that
Sure.
can recite who isn't a Shakespearean actor who can recite
Right.
long bits of text from memory, right? We did lose that skill. And maybe you argue that that skill doesn't matter anymore, so it's no great loss, but we still lost that skill, right? It's yeah. So I'm of two minds about that.
Yeah.
But I take your point about the nostalgia or the fear maybe of I just want my kids to have the exact same experience that I did, and they're not learning if they don't have the exact same
Right.
experience.
And again, even with the ways in which we utilize the technology, because sometimes, for example, handwriting is a really good example, because it's not as much now. It's a little bit still a contentious issue, because there are educators, there are people who think, well, kids should learn how to handwrite. And of course, others saying, like, why? I can tell you right now, there would be days that I would go without ever grabbing a pen and writing that. But learning to handwrite when I was a kid was utilitarian. Like, you have to learn because that's how you communicate. But now handwriting is argued, it's not so much about your ability to write down things. It's how there's a cognitive experience that's happening when you're physically handwriting. And I was talking with Andrew McLuhan, Marshall McLuhan's grandson,
Oh,
who said one of the habits he does is writes. He says writing for 15 minutes a day helps him slow his brain down because he can't write as fast as he can type. And so just it really helps slow everything down. So again, that's not why we taught handwriting 25, 30 years ago. It's because that's how you have to write. So part of it is, I guess, going back to these things, not because it's nostalgia. It's, oh, that was the good old days. It's actually, it served a function that we maybe didn't even consider at one point. And I think and part of that, I think what's interesting, and I want to dive into the AI stuff here, is because as we think about what makes us human, it's a really interesting conversation right now, because we're trying to, and I'll speak specifically in education. People will say education is really about the relationships, and I go, what does that even mean? Tell me what that means. What does it mean? Because we can have relationships using technologies. We're having a hard time articulating and understanding, what is this? Go back to COVID, right? What is it about being in person that matters? We're in person now, but we're not. What would happen if we were in a room together? How would that change the dynamics? And I know I haven't been great at being able to fully articulate and understand that, but I think that's part of the conversation. So when you think about kind of the AI work that you're doing in terms of maintaining humanity, like what are the kind of questions that sort of emerge in your mind around how we're going to navigate that?
Yeah, it's super important and interesting. And if I am optimistic, but more importantly, super engaged in it, it's because AI is just such an interesting question. And it does allow us to ask these really deeply reflective questions about what is it that's the special thing. Because on the one hand, we have things that we thought that animals couldn't do that we now know they can do, build and use tools. And on the other hand, we have things that we used to think the machines couldn't do. Right? But now we're
Right.
seeing them able to do things like create visual images and all the great things that we're seeing them do. But I think that it does give us the potential to think about, well, what is the value? Surely we have a value beyond our ability to reason things out or our ability
Yes.
to know the answer to a question, right? So it can feel existentially scary to look at artificial intelligence's ability to do those things, but maybe it frees us up to see ourselves as spiritual beings, as
Mhm.
embodied beings. I think for all that I would say about all these great things that you and I could be in completely different cities and be talking to each other, there is something about the way that we denied the reality of having a body that maybe artificial intelligence gives us the potential to reclaim. And maybe it's not such a bad thing if we don't think we're so special. Not sure that's such a bad thing.
Yeah, I think that's always like we going back to we've lost the skill. Like we lament that all the time. And it's, wow, do we have to? That's things we don't do things that we did 50 years ago. And sometimes people look back and say, oh, that's too bad. I was like, who cares? And again, it's just interesting conversation to have. And I don't know if we have to lean into science a little bit more, because when you talk about that, the embodiment and what is uniquely human about that. When I was thinking about it, I saw a product the other day where parents can use their avatars as a baby monitor. So they put it in the room and the baby cries, and mom and dad's face comes on the screen, talks to the kid, calms them down. And if you're a parent and you've had kids that cry all night, like you think, oh, that's awesome. But then the question becomes, should we do that? Is that something we should do? Because part of, and not yeah, the physical connection that you would have with a child at that point is yes, the physical touch, but it's also things like your smell. Like we don't take advantage of. There's all those kind of nuanced features. And so as AI, there's all these questions about, will it become sentient? Can it do that? Can AI and AGI have this emotional intelligence that humans have? And it's debatable, but there's lots of people say, yeah, that's all coming. That's the part I go like, where are we going to just say that is just purely a human thing?
Yeah.
And
Well, and in that point of, we already have systems that can mimic that feeling of having emotions or caring for you. And it's mostly certain early adopters who are thinking in these terms about having a relationship with an AI but doesn't the intersubjectivity actually matter, right? If we have the kind of complicated, it matters that my cat or my dog has some sentience, not that it's just an incredibly realistic animatronic thing that can mimic what it's like to be a dog or a cat. And I'm a big skeptic about the ability for these things to have anything like sentience. I'm very skeptical of that, but I'm right in that.
so an interesting example of this, and you're probably familiar with Notebook LM and the podcasting thing that it can do, right?
Yeah.
So in my podcast, I use an AI tool, and when we're done, it's going to go through the transcript and I can pull out all the ums and ahs, right? Remove the filler words. That tool, Notebook LM, actually inserts filler words to make them seem more human. So here we are. I'm trying to make us less human, and the AI is trying to figure out how to make it more human, that things like disfluency. And I think that's the interesting part, is that as humans, we're always trying to move towards some level of perfection, when
Mhm.
in reality, I think what we sometimes appreciate about one another is our imperfections, is the fact that we aren't a robot. So we make mistakes.
Yeah.
I misspeak. I say all of those things, that verbal tics that, I don't know, can be a distraction, but it's also, you're obviously, you're like me. You don't speak perfectly all the time,
Mhm.
and somehow that makes us connect better, right? So
Yeah.
I find this sort of tug of war between trying to use, really, generative AI, ChatGPT is trying to be human. So that's why it hallucinates sometimes. Like, it's not always going to get it right. It's going to give you a reasonable answer, not the answer, but it could be an answer, maybe. So I think I find that fascinating, the way that AI is, that's not obviously not sentience, but its efforts to be more human. And then we sometimes are trying to, in some cases, take our humanity out of the equation and make us sound more artificial.
Yeah, that's a super interesting point. But of course we know like that all those ums and filler words, it's partly that it's communicating things about what's going on inside my head, right? If I'm just speaking effortlessly and I
Sure.
never pause or anything, it's probably because I'm not really thinking too much about the answer. Whereas if I'm pausing and thinking, it's probably a sign that you asked a good question because
Right.
I'm thinking about it, right? We get a lot of what we know about each other doesn't come from the literal content of what we say. It comes from all those verbal and nonverbal cues that come.
So I'm gonna finish with a couple questions, and hopefully maybe even you can relate these to the current work that you're doing at the CVC with your project. But let's start with the negative. So what kind of keeps you up at night when you think about whether AI and the future of technology? So what are the things that kind of concern you most?
Yeah, I don't, as we've discussed, I don't really have a lot of concerns about the sort of artificial general intelligence slash Terminator side of it, but I'm concerned about the implications for the workplace. I'm concerned about the potential for mis and disinformation at scale. Um, those problems with AI, I think, are serious. Uh, but I'm somewhat optimistic about it because I feel like we have learned some lessons based on maybe our naivete about social media, for example, and the downsides of social media. I think we are much more ready now to just say this is a societal conversation, it's a political conversation. Reasonable people might disagree about things like regulation and intervention and so forth, but you don't have to be a technologist to have those conversations. They're political
Right.
conversations, they're social conversations. So that sort of tempers my concerns about AI. But yeah, that I think is probably my biggest feeling about what concerns me.
So
About
could you say a little bit more about some of the work that you're doing now, the project that you're working on now at the CBC around disinformation? Kind of what are some of what is it bringing to mind right now about things that we should be paying attention to, of maybe things that we haven't thought of yet?
I think it's a group that's devoted to visual investigations. So you might have seen the New York Times does kind of stuff a fair bit, which is it's not so much fact checking, but the ability to use what are called OSINT tools, open source investigative tools, things like Google Maps and reverse image search, and to try to reveal information and to do so in a way that is very fact based, in a way that shows your work, right? So it's an effort at being really transparent and honest with the people who are reading or listening to or watching what we do. Um, so that's what the project is. And to the extent that my interest in it is partly in the AI side of things, I do worry about the potential of exactly what we were talking about before, this idea of like disinformation at scale. And also whether it's possible that we get so used to swimming in this soup of not necessarily all fake images or all fake content, but not never knowing whether it's real or fake.
Right.
And I mean, I'm
Yeah.
far from the only person who's talked about this. Like, you know,
Sure.
a lot of people are talking about it, but I think that's a pretty big epistemic crisis when you don't actually know whether you can believe what's going on around you is actually true. I mean, there have always been hucksters and people trying to spin the truth. But I think the ability to just have our information ecosystem potentially drown in that is genuinely alarming.
Yeah. And again, you got technology that's utilized to create that and amplify disinformation, but you're also looking at technology that might solve for that in some way. So so let me transition to the more hopeful side of things, specifically around this, or if you have other kind of things that you're hopeful around technology or slash AI. Do you see a potential where AI or a system could be created to help us better handle dis and misinformation? Is that something that's realistic, or is this just a whack-a-mole thing that we're going to be battling for time immemorial here?
People are working on this idea of how do you create systems of verification, right? There's this whole thing that I don't forget what the acronym is, but there's a whole grouping of um, technology companies and media companies that are looking at ways to verify information. That if something comes to you that some people call watermarking, this is a bit of a different technology than watermarking, to have some verification of if you get this comes from the BBC or it comes from whatever, NPR, that you have a way of verifying that's actually real. So people are looking at specific technological ways to help us navigate this new terrain. And I think we'll get there. I think we're just a little bit behind. I don't worry that. Yeah, I think it's at least a 50-50 chance that we're going to solve this problem. We're going to have some systems for verification of information because it's important.
So when you said that, though, I think about, and I'm sure you had people on your show. I'm sure that's where I heard it. People that were trying to address how do we improve the commenting aspect of social media, whether it's YouTube or whatever else. And there are all kinds of ideas around whether it was upvoting, and then certain places like Reddit and has some of that kind of feature to it where top contributors get a little bit more time and positioning than others. I don't know if that's been solved, but I know that was always an issue. Hey, there's an opportunity for people to come together and have these really rich conversations, but we don't want people just coming in with whether it's racist or misinformation, whatever. How do we weed those folks out? So it's not a new conversation in the world of technology. It's just that the stakes have probably increased in terms of what that's.
And it feels like it's happening way faster than feels like we had a little bit more time to go from message boards and moderators of like online communities to where we are now in social media, whereas the generative AI stuff seems to have happened extremely quickly, right? I'm sure it hasn't, but it feels that way.
For sure. So what are you hopeful for? What do you see as, I'm excited for this, or I think this could really make a difference in our world?
To counter what I was saying before about AI, there are some things that I'm excited about with AI. I read this book a long time ago by Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson called The Second Machine Age. And they talk about this metaphor that has really stuck with me, this idea of centaur skills. Centaur is after the half human, half horse creature of Greek mythology. And how if we get the technology right, we can build these things that take advantage of both the skills the machine has and the skills that we have together. And they make the point, I believe in this book, that we can look at the example of centaur chess, which is a thing where you have tag teams of humans and machine chess players, and that can do better together than either a human grandmaster or a machine can do, right? So that's the goal, is figure out what is it that maximizes the best that humans do and the best that these systems do and bring them together. So that gives me optimism. And I also am optimistic about the renewed push towards a decentralized, interoperable online space, whether it's things like metaverse that just offer the potential for some of that, the power of that distributed communication again. So that gives me optimism. It gives me optimism that people are still like devoting long, hard hours to figuring this stuff out. That's optimistic too.
Well, and I appreciate that. And as I work with schools and education talking about AI, I catch myself going down the bad road of like, this guy must think we're all, yeah, because there are days that I think maybe we're all doomed. So I need to bring myself back up to say, but there's some good things too. There's some good things too. So I'm trying, like I tell people, like I sit on the fence constantly, and I probably will be on the fence for quite a while. And it's not as a human being, that's an awkward place to sit, because we like to identify, that's how we survive. That's good, that's bad. And so, yeah, that's not the way to approach it. So it's tough. But again, that's why I like the community part. So I love hearing people like you and others to share something that I hadn't thought about that. So I appreciate that. All right. You've been so gracious with your time, but I want to do a quick wrap up. I call them the fun questions. I actually don't know how fun they are. Maybe they're fun, but not. So let's talk about you've tossed out a few books that you've read in the past that have helped you. Is there anything you're currently reading right now professionally that you're excited about, or give a shout out around?
I just got a copy of Ron Diebert's book. I'm going to go and get it. I was at the book launch. It's called Chasing Shadows, and it's he's the director of the Citizen Lab, which is a research group based out of the University of Toronto that focuses on how technology is used to oppress people and how it's used by repressed governments. And so this is the story of the Citizen Lab, but it's very exciting. It's got a lot of like really interesting stuff in it. So I'm enjoying that. I've been making my way through a bunch of philosophical and spiritual books because I inherited the office of person who hosted the spirituality show on CBC Radio. So there are all these books left behind. So I'm currently reading the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius because I'm making my way through these books, which is nice. It's like it's a curated library.
Nice. Yeah, it's fun. So that's heavy stuff. But what about like your brain just can't function? So I need something, I say trashy, guilty pleasure, but I think it's always fun to hang out with people like who's maybe a little bit embarrassed to say, maybe not. Maybe you're super intellectual all the time and you only watch documentaries or whatever. But so what would be your guilty pleasure of a binge show to watch?
My guilty pleasure, there's so many really, I have to say, but my current guilty pleasure is the UK version of the reality show, The Traitors, which is the show, I don't know if you know, is that they go to this
my wife watches it. I catch bits and pieces of it, but I do get engaged when I watch it. UK version of almost anything is better, but that's just...
And I partly hate watch it because the people on it, they try to apply these rational things about why you can't trust this person, but I'm like, it's a game. They don't want to be untrustworthy. They've been given that role anyway. But also the host has these fantastic outfits. She has fantastic sweaters. So that's part of the reason why I like to watch it.
I think, I'm trying to think. I know she watches the Canadian version. I think she does watch the UK version as well, but yeah.
Okay.
And I love that phrase, hate watching, because I had a conversation with a colleague about what that actually meant. And she was telling me that when she travels, that's her thing, is she goes into a hotel and that's when she hate watches because she's not at home. I thought it was a bizarre but I thought maybe that makes sense. Like I can't even remember what the show was, but I thought the concept was interesting. All right, last question. I didn't ask you, but I'm assuming looking behind you that you're in Toronto.
I am in downtown Toronto with a large amount of snow for once. It's not usual for us.
Yes. All right. I have lots of guests on from Toronto, but I want your hidden gem. Like, so I'm there a lot. What's the restaurant, the park, the museum, the place that most people don't talk about this, but this is a little hidden gem you should go check out?
I realize I probably shouldn't be naming a bar as hidden gem, but I am going to name a bar, which is called Decoy, which is on Queen Street East around Parliament Street. And I go there occasionally with friends because it's a midway point between people who live in the west end of the city and people who live in the east end of the city. But it's just a very simple place with just nice music, very simple decor, good craft beers. And it just is, there's something about those places that are like totally unpretentious, but just feel like welcoming and grounding and fantastic. That is my hidden gem.
Thank you for that. And I like that because I'm of a certain age where my first question would be, is it loud there? If it's loud, but you've described a place where I think I would go there because it doesn't sound like it's loud there.
Yeah, it's not that loud, no.
Okay. And that really, Yelp
Like,
should have that. Like, how loud is it? Really,
yeah.
just tell me before I go there. Don't try to impress me with your music go blaring over. So, anyway, Nora, I hope I tried to hold in my enthusiasm and excitement to have you in the show. I don't know if I had to, but I am really grateful for having you on again. So admire all the work that you've done. I look forward to more stuff you do. So, thank you so much for giving your time and sharing your insights from a really rich and I think pretty amazing career you've had.
Thank you so much. And thank you for inviting me. It was fun.